The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 5, Side 2. In the scale against these stories, we can only say that for 4 years after Catiline's death, the common people of Rome, the miserable, starveling rabble, Cicero called them, strewed flowers upon his tomb. Sallust quotes what purports to be one of his speeches. Ever since the state fell under the sway of a few powerful men, all influence, rank, and wealth have been in their hands. To us they have left danger, defeat, prosecutions, poverty. What have we left save only the breath of life? Is it not better to die valiantly than to lose our wretched and dishonored lives after being the sport of other men's insolence? The program on which he proposed to unite the heterogeneous elements of revolution was simple. Novi tabulae, new records, that is, a clean sweep and abolition of all debts. He labored for this purpose with all the energy of a Caesar. Indeed, for a time he had the sympathy, if not the secret support of Caesar. There was nothing, said Cicero, that he could not undergo, no pains that he would spare of cooperation, vigilance, and toil. He could bear cold, hunger, and thirst. We are assured by his enemies that he organized a band of 400 men who planned to kill the consuls and seize the government on the first day of 65. The day came, and nothing unusual transpired. At the end of 64, Catiline stood against Cicero for the consulate and waged a vigorous campaign. Capital took fright and began to leave Italy. The upper classes united in support of Cicero. For a year, the Concordia Ordinum that he had asked for was a reality, and he was its perfect voice. Blocked politically, Catiline turned to war. Secretly, his followers organized an army of 20,000 men in Etruria, and gathered together in Rome a group of conspirators that included representatives of every class, from senators to slaves, and 2 urban praetors, Cethegus and Lentulus. In the following October, Catiline again ran for the consulate. To make sure of his election, conservative historians tell us, he planned to have his rival murdered during the campaign, and to have Cicero assassinated at the same time. Claiming that he had been apprised of these plans, Cicero filled the field of Mars with armed guards and superintended the voting. Despite the enthusiastic support of the proletariat, Catiline was again defeated. On November 7th, says Cicero, several conspirators knocked at his door but were driven away by his guards. On the morrow, seeing Catiline in the Senate, Cicero flung at him that superb excoriation which once every schoolboy mouthed. As the oration proceeded, the seats around Catiline were emptied one by one until he sat alone. Silently he bore the torrent of accusations, the sharp, relentless phrases falling like whips upon his head. Cicero played upon every emotion. He spoke of the nation as the common father, and of Catiline as in intent a parricide. He charged him, not with evidence given but by innuendo and implication, with conspiracy against the state, with theft, adultery, and sexual abnormality. Finally, he petitioned Jove to protect Rome and to devote Catiline to eternal punishment. When Cicero had finished, Catiline walked out unhindered and joined his forces in Etruria. His general, L. Manlius, sent a last appeal to the Senate. "We call gods and men to witness that it is not against our country that we have taken up arms, nor against the safety of our fellow citizens. We wretched paupers, who through the violence and cruelty of usurers are without a country, condemned to scorn and indigence, are actuated by only one wish, to guarantee our personal security against wrong. We demand neither power nor wealth, those great and external causes of strife among mankind. We only ask for freedom, a treasure that no man will surrender except with life itself. We implore you, senators, have pity on your miserable fellow citizens." The next day, in a second oration, Cicero described the rebels' following as centering around a coterie of perfumed perverts, and indulged without stint his genius for sarcasm and invective, ending again on a religious note. In the following weeks he presented evidence to the Senate purporting to show that Catiline had tried to stir up revolution in Gaul. On December 3rd he had Lentulus, Cethegus, and 5 other adherents of Catiline arrested. In a third oration he declared their guilt, announced their imprisonment, and told the Senate and the people that the conspiracy was broken and that they might retire to their homes in security and peace. On December 5th, he convoked the Senate and asked what should be done with the prisoners. Silanus voted that they should be executed. Caesar advised mere imprisonment, recalling that the execution of a Roman citizen was forbidden by the Sempronian law. In a fourth oration, Cicero gently advised death. Cato gave the opinion the sanction of his philosophy, and death won the day. Some young aristocrats tried to kill Caesar as he left the Senate chamber, but he escaped. Cicero, with armed men, went to the jail and had the sentence carried out with a minimum of delay. Marcus Antonius, co-consul with Cicero and father of a famous son, was sent north with an army to destroy Catiline's force. The Senate promised pardon and 200,000 sesterces to every man who would leave the rebel ranks. But, says Sallust, not one deserted from Catiline's camp. On the plains of Pistoia battle was joined in 61. The 3,000 insurgents, far outnumbered, fought to the end around their treasured standards, the eagles of Marius. None surrendered or took flight. Every one of them died on the field, among them Catiline. Being essentially a man of thought rather than of action, Cicero was surprised and impressed by the skill and courage he had shown in suppressing a dangerous revolt. The direction of so great an enterprise, he told the Senate, seems scarcely possible to merely human wisdom. He compared himself with Romulus, but considered it a greater deed to have preserved Rome than to have founded it. Senators and magnates smiled at his language, but they knew that he had saved them. Cato and Catullus hailed him as pater patriae, father of his country. When, at the end of 63, he laid down his office, all the propertied classes in the community, he tells us, gave him thanks, named him immortal, and escorted him in honor to his home. The proletariat did not join in these demonstrations. It could not forgive him for violating the laws of Rome by putting citizens to death without appeal. It felt that he had made no effort to remove the causes of Catiline's revolt, or to mitigate the poverty of the masses. It refused to let him address the assembly on that last day, and listened in anger when he swore that he had preserved the city. The revolution was not over. With Caesar's consulate, it would begin again. Chapter 8. Literature under the Revolution, 145 to 30 B.C. 1. Lucretius. Amid this turbulent transformation of economy, government, and morals, literature was not forgotten, and did not quite escape the fever and stimulus of the age. Varro and Nepos found safety in antiquarian scholarship or historical research. Sallust retired from his campaigns to defend his party and disguise his morals with brilliant monographs. Caesar stooped from empire to grammar and continued his wars in his commentaries. Catullus and Calvus sought refuge from politics in the pursuit and poetry of love. Timid and sensitive spirits like Lucretius hid themselves in the gardens of philosophy, and Cicero retreated now and then from the heat of the forum to cool his blood with books. But not one of them found peace. War and revolution touched them with pervasive infection, and even Lucretius must have known the restlessness which he describes. There is a weight on their minds, and a mountain of misery lies on their hearts. For each, not knowing what he wants, seeks always to change his place, as if he could drop his burden. Here is one who, bored to death at home, goes forth every now and then from his palace, but feeling no better abroad, suddenly returns. Off he courses, driving his nags to his country house in headlong haste. He has hardly crossed the threshold when he yawns, or seeks oblivion in a heavy sleep, or even hurries back to the city. So each man flees from himself, but as one might expect, the self which he cannot escape cleaves to him all the more against his will. He hates himself because, a sick man, he does not know the cause of his complaint. Any man who could see that clearly would cast aside his business, and before all else, would seek to understand the nature of things. His poem is our only biography of Titus Lucretius Carus. It is proudly reticent about its author, and outside of it, barring a few allusions, Roman literature is strangely silent about one of its greatest men. Tradition placed his birth at 99 or 95, his death at 55 or 51 B.C. He lived through half a century of the Roman Revolution, through the social war, Marian massacres and sullen proscriptions, through Catiline's conspiracy and Caesar's consulate. The aristocracy to which he probably belonged was in obvious decay. The world in which he lived was falling apart into a chaos that left no life or fortune secure. His poem is a longing for physical and mental peace. Lucretius sought refuge in nature, philosophy, and poetry. Perhaps also he had a round of love. He must have fared badly, for he writes ungallantly of women, denounces the lure of beauty, and advises itching youth to appease the flesh with calm promiscuity. In woods and fields, in plants and animals, in mountain, river, and sea, he found a delight only rivaled by his passion for philosophy. He was as impressionable as Wordsworth, as keen of sense as Keats, as prone as Shelley to find metaphysics in a pebble or a leaf. Nothing of nature's loveliness or terror was lost upon him. He was stirred by the forms and sounds, odors and savors of things. He felt the silences of secret haunts, the quiet falling of the night, the lazy waking of the day. Everything natural was a marvel to him, the patient flow of water, the sprouting of seeds, the endless changes of the sky, the imperturbable persistence of the stars. He observed animals with curiosity and sympathy, loved their forms of strength or grace, felt their sufferings, and wondered at their wordless philosophy. No poet before him had so expressed the grandeur of the world in its detailed variety and its congregated power. Here at last nature won the citadels of literature, and rewarded her poet with a force of descriptive speech that only Homer and Shakespeare have surpassed. So responsive a spirit must have been deeply moved in youth by the mystery and pageantry of religion. But the ancient faith, which had once served family discipline and social order, had lost its hold on the educated classes of Rome. Caesar smiled indulgently as he played Pontifex Maximus, and the banquets of the priests were the holy days of Roman epicures. A small minority of the people were open atheists. Now and then some Roman Alcibiades nocturnally mutilated the statues of the gods. No longer inspired or consoled by the official ritual, many among the lower classes were flocking to the blood-stained shrines of the Phrygian Great Mother, or the Cappadocian goddess Ma, or some of the Oriental deities that had entered Italy with soldiers or captives from the East. Under the influence of Greek or Asiatic cults, the old Roman idea of Orcus as a colorless subterranean abode of all the indiscriminate dead had developed into belief in a literal hell, a Tartarus or Acheron, of endless suffering for all but a reborn, initiated few. The sun and the moon were conceived as gods, and every eclipse sent terror into lonely villages and teeming tenements. Chaldean fortune-tellers and astrologers were overrunning Italy, casting horoscopes for paupers and millionaires, revealing hidden treasures and future events, interpreting omens and dreams with cautious ambiguity and profitable flattery. Every unusual occurrence in nature was examined as the warning of a god. It was this mass of superstition, ritualism, and hypocrisy that Lucretius knew as religion. No wonder that he rebelled against it and attacked it with all the ardor of a religious reformer. We may judge from the bitterness of his resentment the depth of his youthful piety and the distress of his disillusionment. Seeking for some alternative faith, he passed through the skepticism of Ennius to the great poem in which Empedocles had expounded evolution and the conflict of opposites. When he discovered the writings of Epicurus, it seemed to him that he had found the answers to his questions. That strange mixture of materialism and free will, of joyful gods and a godless world, appealed to him as a free man's answer to doubt and fear. A breath of liberation from supernatural terrors seemed to come out of Epicurus's garden, revealing the omnipresence of law, the self-ruled independence of nature, the forgivable naturalness of death. Lucretius resolved to take this philosophy out of the ungainly prose in which Epicurus had expressed it, fuse it into poetic form, and offer it to his generation as the way, the truth, and the life. He felt in himself a rare and double power, the objective perception of the scientist and the subjective emotion of the poet, and he saw in the total order of nature a sublimity, and in nature's parts a beauty, that encouraged and justified this marriage of philosophy and poetry. His great purpose aroused all his powers, lifted him to a unique intellectual exuberance, and left him, before its completion, exhausted and perhaps insane. But his long and delightful toil gave him a consuming happiness, and he poured into it all the devotion of a profoundly religious soul. He chose for his work a philosophical rather than a poetic title, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, a simple translation of the Periphysios, about nature, which the pre-Socratics had used as a common name for their treatises. He offered it to the sons of Caius Memmius, praetor in 58, as a road from fear to understanding. He took as his model the Empedoclean epic of exposition, as his speech the quaint bluntness of Ennius, as his medium the mobile and versatile hexameter. And then, forgetting for a moment the distant carelessness of the gods, he began with a fervent apostrophe to Venus, conceived, like Empedocles' love, as a symbol of creative desire and the ways of peace. Mother of Aeneas's race, delight of men and gods, O nurturing Venus! Through thee every kind of life is conceived and born, and looks upon the sun. Before thee and thy coming the winds flee, and the clouds of the sky depart. To thee the miraculous earth lifts up sweet flowers, and for thee the waves of the sea laugh, and the peaceful heavens shine with overspreading light. For as soon as the springtime face of day appears, and the fertilizing south wind makes all things fresh and green, then first the birds of the air proclaim thee and thy advent, O divine one, pierced to the heart by thy power. Then the wild herds leap over the glad pastures, and cross the swift streams. So, held captive by thy charm, each one follows thee wherever thou goest to lead. Then through seas and mountains and rushing rivers, and the leafy dwellings of the birds, and the verdant fields, thou strikest soft love into the breasts of all creatures, and makest them to propagate their generations after their kinds. Since, therefore, thou alone rulest the nature of things, since without thee nothing rises to the shining shores of light, nothing joyful or lovely is born, I long for thee as a partner in the writing of these verses. Grant to my words, O goddess, an undying beauty. Cause, meanwhile, the savage works of war to sleep and be still. As Mars reclines upon thy sacred form, bend thou around him from above, pour sweet coaxings from thy mouth, and beg for thy Romans the gift of peace. 2. De Rerum Natura. If we try to reduce to some logical form the passionate disorder of Lucretius's argument, his initial thesis lies in a famous line, Tantum religio potuit suadere malorum. To so many evils religion has persuaded men. He tells the story of Iphigenia in Aulis, of countless human sacrifices, of hecatombs offered to gods conceived in the image of man's greed. He recalls the terror of simplicity and youth lost in a jungle of vengeful deities, the fear of lightning and thunder, of death and hell, and the subterranean horrors pictured in Etruscan art and Oriental mysteries. He reproaches mankind for preferring sacrificial ritual to philosophical understanding. O miserable race of men, to impute to the gods such acts as these, and such bitter wrath! What sorrow did men through such creeds prepare for themselves? What wounds for us? What tears for our children? For piety lies not in being often seen turning a veiled head to stones, nor in approaching every altar, nor in lying prostrate before the temples of the gods, nor in sprinkling altars with the blood of beasts, but rather in being able to look upon all things with a mind at peace. There are gods, says Lucretius, but they dwell far off in happy isolation from the thought or cares of men. There, beyond the flaming ramparts of the world, extra flammantia menia mundi, beyond the reach of our sacrifices and prayers, they live like followers of Epicurus, shunning worldly affairs, content with the contemplation of beauty and the practices of friendship and peace. They are not the authors of creation, nor the causes of events. Who would be so unfair as to charge them with the wastefulness, the disorder, the sufferings, and the injustices of earthly life? No, this infinite universe of many worlds is self-contained. It has no law outside itself. Nature does everything of her own accord. For who is strong enough to rule the sum of things, to hold in hand the mighty bridle of the unfathomable deep? Who to turn all the heavens around at once, to shake the serene sky with thunder, to launch the lightning that often shatters temples, and cast the bolt that slays the innocent and passes the guilty by? The only God is law, and the truest worship, as well as the only peace, lies in learning that law and loving it. This terror and gloom of the mind must be dispelled not by the sun's rays, but by the aspect and law of nature. And so, touching with the honey of the Muses the rough materialism of Democritus, Lucretius proclaims as his basic theorem that nothing exists but atoms and the void, that is, matter and space. He proceeds at once to a cardinal principle and assumption of modern science, that the quantity of matter and motion in the world never varies. No thing arises out of nothing, and destruction is only a change of form. The atoms are indestructible, unchangeable, solid, resilient, soundless, odorless, tasteless, colorless, infinite. They interpenetrate one another to produce endless combinations and qualities. They move without cease in the seeming stillness of motionless things. For often on a hill woolly sheep go creeping wherever the dew-sparkling grass tempts them, and the well-fed lambs play and butt their heads in sport. Yet in the distance all these are blurred together and seem but a whiteness resting on a green hill. Sometimes great armies cover wide fields in maneuvers mimicking war. The brilliant bronze of their shields illumines the countryside and is mirrored in the sky. The ground trembles and thunders under their marching feet and their galloping steeds, and the mountains, buffeted by the sound, hurl it back to the very stars. And yet there is a place on the peaks from which these armies appear to be motionless, a little brightness resting on the plain. The atoms have parts, minima, or least things, each minimum being solid, indivisible, ultimate. Lucretius never uses the word atom, but calls his primordial particles primordia, elementa, or semina, or seeds. Perhaps because of the different arrangement of these parts, the atoms vary in size and shape, and so make possible the refreshing diversity of nature. The atoms do not move in straight or uniform lines. There is in their motion an incalculable declination or deviation, an elemental spontaneity that runs through all things and culminates in a man's free will. All was once formless, but the gradual assortment of the moving atoms by their size and shape produced, without design, air, fire, water, and earth, and out of these the sun and moon, the planets and stars. In the infinity of space new worlds are ever being born, and old worlds are wasting away. The stars are fires set in the ring of ether, a mist of thinnest atoms, that surrounds each planetary system. This cosmic wall of fire constitutes the flaming ramparts of the world. A portion of the primeval mist broke off from the mass, revolved separately and cooled to form the earth. Earthquakes are not the growling of deities, but the expansion of subterranean gases and streams. Thunder and lightning are not the voice and breath of a god, but natural results of condensed and clashing clouds. Rain is not the mercy of Jove, but the return to earth of moisture evaporated from it by the sun. Life does not differ essentially from other matter. It is a product of moving atoms which are individually dead. As the universe took form by the inherent laws of matter, so the earth produced by a purely natural selection all the species and organs of life. Nothing arises in the body in order that we may use it, but what arises brings forth its own use. It was no design of the atoms that led them to arrange themselves in order with keen intelligence, but because many atoms in infinite time have moved and met in all manner of ways, trying all combinations. Hence arose the beginnings of great things and the generations of living creatures. Many were the monsters that the earth tried to make, some without feet, and others without hands or mouth or face, or with limbs bound to their frames. It was in vain. Nature denied them growth, nor could they find food or join in the way of love. Many kinds of animals must have perished then, unable to forge the chain of procreation, for those to which nature gave no protective qualities lay at the mercy of others, and were soon destroyed. Mind, or animus, is an organ precisely like feet or eyes. It is, like them, a tool or function of that soul, or anima, or vital breath, which is spread as a very fine matter throughout the body, and animates every part. Upon the highly sensitive atoms that form the mind fall the images or films that perpetually emanate from the surfaces of things. This is the source of sensation. Taste, smell, hearing, sight, and touch are caused by particles coming from objects and striking tongue or palate, nostrils, ears, eyes, or skin. All senses are forms of touch. The senses are the final test of truth. If they seem to err, it is only through misinterpretation, and only another sense can correct them. Reason cannot be the test of truth, for reason depends upon experience, that is, sensation. The soul is neither spiritual nor immortal. It could not move the body unless it too were corporeal. It grows and ages with the body. It is affected like the body by disease, medicine, or wine. Its atoms are apparently dispersed when the body dies. Soul without body would be senseless, meaningless. Of what use would soul be without organs of touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight? Life is given us not in freehold but on loan, and for so long as we can make use of it. When we have exhausted our powers, we should leave the table of life as graciously as a grateful guest rising from a feast. Death itself is not terrible, only our fears of the hereafter make it so. But there is no hereafter. Hell is here in the suffering that comes from ignorance, passion, pugnacity, and greed. Heaven is here in the sapientum templa serena, the serene temples of the wise. Virtue lies not in the fear of the gods, nor in the timid shunning of pleasure. It lies in the harmonious operation of senses and faculties guided by reason. Some men wear out their lives for the sake of a statue and fame, but the real wealth of man is to live simply with a mind at peace. Vivere parce aequo animo. Better than living stiffly in gilded halls is to lie in groups upon the soft grass beside a rivulet and under tall trees, or to hear gentle music, or lose one's ego in the love and care of our children. Marriage is good, but passionate love is a madness that strips the mind of clarity and reason. If one is wounded by the shafts of Venus, whether it be a boy with girlish limbs who launches the shaft, or a woman radiating love from her whole body, he is drawn toward the source of the blow and longs to unite. No marriage and no society can find a sound basis in such erotic befuddlement. As Lucretius, exhausting his passions on philosophy, finds no room for romantic love, so he rejects the romantic anthropology of Greek Rousseauians who had glorified primitive life. Men were hardier then, to be sure, but they dwelt in caves without fire, they mated without marriage, killed without law, and died of starvation as frequently as people in civilization die of overeating. How civilization developed, Lucretius tells in a pretty summary of ancient anthropology. Social organization gave man the power to survive animals far stronger than himself. He discovered fire from the friction of leaves and boughs, developed language from gestures, and learned song from the birds. He tamed animals for his use, and himself with marriage and law. He tilled the soil, wove cloth, molded metals into tools. He observed the heavens, measured time, and learned navigation. He improved the art of killing, conquered the weak, and built cities and states. History is a procession of states and civilizations rising, prospering, decaying, dying. But each in turn transmits the civilizing heritage of customs, morals, and arts. Like runners in a race, they hand on the lamps of life. Et quasi cursores vitae lampada tradunt. All things that grow decay. Organs, organisms, families, states, races, planets, stars. Only the atoms never die. The forces of creation and development are balanced by the forces of destruction in a vast diastole and systole of life and death. In nature there is evil as well as good. Suffering, even unmerited, comes to every life, and dissolution dogs the steps of every evolution. Our earth itself is dying. Earthquakes are breaking it up. The land is becoming exhausted. Rains and rivers erode it, and carry even the mountains at last into the sea. Someday our whole stellar system will suffer a like mortality. The walls of the sky will be stormed on every side and will collapse into a crumbling ruin. But the very moment of mortality betrays the invincible vitality of the world. The wailing of the newborn infant is mingled with the dirge sung for the dead. New systems form, new stars and planets, another earth, and fresher life. Evolution begins again. Looking back over this most marvelous performance in all antique literature, we may first recognize its shortcomings, the chaos of its contents, left unrevised by the poet's early death, the repetition of phrases, lines, whole passages, the conception of sun, moon, and stars as no larger than we see them, the inability of the system to explain how dead atoms became life and consciousness, the insensitiveness to the insights, consolations, inspirations, and moving poetry of faith, and the moral and social functions of religion. But how light these faults are in the scale against the brave attempt at a rational interpretation of the universe, of history, of religion, of disease. The picture of nature as a world of law in which matter and motion are never diminished or increased, the grandeur of the theme and the nobility of its treatment, the sustained power of imagination that feels everywhere the majesty of things and lifts the visions of Empedocles, the science of Democritus, and the ethics of Epicurus into some of the loftiest poetry that any age has known. Here was a language still rough and immature, almost devoid as yet of philosophical or scientific terms. Lucretius does not merely create a new vocabulary, he forces the old speech into new channels of rhythm and grace, and while molding the hexameter into an unequaled masculinity of power, reaches now and then the mellow tenderness and fluency of Virgil. The sustained vitality of his poem shows Lucretius as one who amid all sufferings and disappointments enjoyed and exhausted life almost from birth to death. How did he die? St. Jerome reports that Lucretius was driven mad by a love philtre after he had written several books. He died by his own hand in his 44th year. The story is uncorroborated and has been much doubted. No saint could be trusted to give an objective account of Lucretius. Some critics have found support for the story in the unnatural tension of the poem, its poorly organized contents, and its sudden end. But one need not be a Lucretius to be excitable, disorderly, or dead. Like Euripides, Lucretius is a modern. His thought and feeling are more congenial to our time than to the century before Christ. Horace and Virgil were deeply influenced by him in their youth, and recall him without name in many a lordly phrase. But the attempt of Augustus to restore the old faith made it unwise for these imperial protégés to express too openly their admiration and their debt. The Epicurean philosophy was as unsuited to the Roman mind as Epicurean practices suited Roman taste in the age of Lucretius. Rome wanted a metaphysic that would exalt mystic powers rather than natural law, an ethic that would make a virile and martial people rather than humanitarian lovers of quiet and peace, and a political philosophy that, like those of Virgil and Horace, would justify Rome's imperial mastery. In the resurrection of faith after Seneca, Lucretius was almost forgotten. Not till Poggio rediscovered him in 1418 did he begin to influence European thought. A physician of Verona, Girolamo Fracastoro, 1483 to 1553, took from the poet the theory of disease as due to noxious seeds or semina floating in the air, and in 1647 Gassendi revived the atomic philosophy. Voltaire read the De Rerum Natura devotedly and agreed with Ovid that its rebel verses would last as long as the earth. In the endless struggle of East and West, of tender-minded and consoling faiths versus a tough-minded and materialistic science, Lucretius waged alone the most vigorous battle of his time. He is, of course, the greatest of philosophical poets. In him, as in Catullus and Cicero, Latin literature came of age, and leadership in letters passed at last from Greece to Rome. 3. Lesbia's lover. In 57 BC, the Caius Memmius to whom Lucretius dedicated his poem left Rome to serve as propraetor in Bithynia. After the growing custom of Roman governors, he took with him an author, not Lucretius, but a poet different from the other in everything but the strength of his passion. Quintus, or Caius Valerius Catullus, had come to Rome some 5 years before from his native Verona, where his father was of sufficient standing to be frequent host to Caesar. Quintus himself must have had a substantial competence, for he owned villas near Tiber and on Lake Garda, and had an elegant house in Rome. He speaks of these properties as choked with mortgages and repeatedly proclaims his poverty, but the picture we form of him from his poems is that of a polished man of the world who did not bother to earn a living, but enjoyed himself unstintingly among the wilder set in the capital. The keenest wits, the cleverest young orators and politicians belonged to this circle. Marcus Caelius, the impecunious aristocrat who was to become a communist, Licinius Calvus, brilliant in poetry and in law, and Helvius Cinna, a poet whom Antony's mob would mistake for one of Caesar's assassins and beat to death. These men opposed Caesar with every epigram at their disposal, unaware that their literary revolt reflected the revolution in which they lived. They were tired of old forms in literature, of the crudity and bombast of Naevius and Ennius. They wished to sing the sentiments of youth in new and lyric meters, and with a refinement and delicacy of execution known once in the Alexandria of Callimachus, but never yet seen in Rome. And they were resentful of old morals, of the mos maiorum perpetually preached upon them by their exhausted elders. They announced the sanctity of instinct, the innocence of desire, and the grandeur of dissipation. They and Catullus were no worse than other young literary blades of their generation and the next. Horace, Ovid, Tibullus, Propertius, even the shy Virgil in his youth, made life and verse revolve around any woman, married or not, who fed their muses with facile, casual love. The liveliest lady in this group was Clodia, of the proud old Claudian gents that even now had emperors in its loins. Apuleius assures us that it was she whom Catullus named Lesbia, in memory of the Sappho whose poems he occasionally translated, often imitated, and always loved. Arriving in Rome at the age of 22, he cultivated her friendship while her husband governed Cisalpine Gaul. He was fascinated the moment she set her shining foot on the well-worn threshold. He called her his lustrous goddess of the delicate step, and indeed a woman's walk, like her voice, may be in itself a sufficient seduction. She accepted him graciously as one of her worshippers, and the enraptured poet, unable to match otherwise the gifts of his rivals, laid at her feet the most beautiful lyrics in the Latin tongue. For her he translated perfectly Sappho's description of the lover's frenzy that now raged in him, and to the sparrow that she pressed to her bosom he indited a jewel of jealousy. Sparrow, delight of my beloved, who plays with you and holds you to her breast, who offers her forefinger to your seeking and tempts your sharp bite, I know not what dear jest it pleases my shining one to make of my desire. For a while he was consumed with happiness, played attendance upon her daily, read his poems to her, forgot everything but his infatuation. Let us live, Lesbia mine, and love, and all the mumbling of harsh old men we shall reckon as a pennyworth. Suns may sink and return. For us, when once our brief sun has set, there comes the long sleep of everlasting night. Give me 1,000 kisses, then 100, then another 1,000, then a second 100, then still another 1,000, then 100. And when we shall have reached many thousands, we shall confuse the count, lest we should ever know, or some mean soul should envy us, learning the great sum of our kisses. We do not know how long this ecstasy lasted. Probably his thousands wearied her, and she who had betrayed her husband for him found it a relief to betray him for another. Her benefactions now ranged so widely that Catullus madly fancied her embracing at once 300 adulterers. In the very heat of his love he came to hate her, odi et amo, and rejected with a Keatsian image her protestations of fidelity. A woman's words to hungry lovers said should be upon the flowing winds inscribed, upon swift streams engraved. When sharp doubt became dull certainty, his passion turned to bitterness and coarse revenge. He accused her of yielding to tavern habitués, denounced her new lovers with obscene abandon, and meditated suicide poetically. At the same time he was capable of nobler feelings. He addressed to his friend Manlius a touching epithalamium or wedding song, envying him the wholesome comradeship of marriage, the security and stability of a home, and the happy tribulations of parentage. He snatched himself from the scene by accompanying Memmius to Bithynia, but he was disappointed in his hopes of restoring there his spirits or his purse. He went out of his way to find the grave of a brother who had died in the Troad. Over it he performed reverently the ancestral burial rites, and soon afterward he composed tender lines that gave the world a famous phrase. Dear brother, through many states and seas have I come to this sorrowful sacrifice, bringing you the last gift for the dead. Accept these offerings wet with fraternal tears, and forever, brother, hail and farewell. His sojourn in Asia changed and softened him. The skeptic, who had written of death as the sleep of an eternal night, was moved by the old religions and ceremonies of the East. In the rich and flowing verse of his greatest poem, Attis, he described with vivid intensity the worship of Cybele, and caught an exotic fervor in the lament of the self-emasculated devotee over the joys and friends of his youth. In Peleus and Thetis, he retold the tale of Peleus and Ariadne in hexameters of such melodious delicacy as even Virgil would hardly equal. In a small yacht bought at Amastris, he sailed through the Black Sea, the Aegean, and the Adriatic, and up the Po to Lake Garda and his villa at Sirmio. "Oh, what happier way is there to escape the cares of the world," he asked, "than to return to our own homes and altars and rest on our own beloved bed? Men begin by seeking happiness and are content at last with peace." We know Catullus more intimately than most Roman poets because his subject is nearly always himself. These lyric cries of love and hate reveal a sensitive and kindly spirit, capable of generous feeling even for relatives, but unpleasantly self-centered, deliberately obscene, and merciless to his enemies. He published their most private peculiarities, their pederastic propensities, their bodily odor. One of them washes his teeth with urine, after an old Spanish custom. Another is so foul of breath that if he should open his mouth all persons near him would fall dead. Catullus oscillates easily between love and awful, kisses and fundaments. He rivals Martial as a guide to the street-corner urology of Rome, and suggests in his contemporaries and his class a mixture of primitive coarseness with civilized refinement, as if educated Romans, however versed in the literature of Greece, could never quite forget the stable and the camp. Catullus pleads, like Martial, that he must salt his lines with dirt to hold his audience. He atoned for these faults by the conscientious perfection of his verse. His hendecasyllabics leap with a naturalness and spontaneity that escape the artifices of Horace and occasionally rise above all the graces of Virgil. It took much art to conceal his art, and Catullus more than once refers to the painful toil and care that produced his quick intelligibility and apparent ease. His vocabulary helped him to this end. He molded the words of popular speech into poetry, and enriched the Latin of literature with affectionate diminutives as well as tavern slang. He avoided inversions and obscurities, and gave to his lines a limpid fluidity grateful to the ear. He pored over the poets of Hellenistic Alexandria and ancient Ionia, mastered the smooth technique and varied meters of Callimachus, the lusty directness of Archilochus, the vinous exuberance of Anacreon, the amorous ecstasy of Sappho. Indeed, it is largely through him that we must guess how these poets wrote. He learned their lessons so thoroughly that he became, from their pupil, their equal. He did for Latin poetry what Cicero did for Latin prose. He took it as crude potency and lifted it to an art that only Virgil would surpass. 4. The Scholars. How were Latin books written, illustrated, bound, published, sold? For school exercises, short letters, transient commercial records, the Romans through antiquity wrote with a stylus upon waxed tablets and erased with the thumb. The oldest literary Latin known to us was written with quill and ink upon paper manufactured in Egypt from the pressed and glued leaves of the papyrus tree. In the first centuries of our era, parchment made from the dried skins of animals began to rival papyrus as a receptacle of literature and important documents. A folded sheet of membrane, or vellum, constituted a diploma, or twofold. Usually, a literary work was issued as a roll, or volumen, wound up, and was read by unrolling as the reading progressed. The text was customarily written 2 or 3 narrow columnae to a page, often without punctuation of clauses or even separation of words. Some manuscripts were illustrated by ink drawings. Varro's Imagines, for example, consisted of 700 portraits of famous men, each picture accompanied by a biographical note. Anyone could publish a manuscript by hiring slaves to make copies and selling the copies. Rich men had clerks who copied for them any book they wished to own. Since copyists were fed rather than paid, books were cheap. First printings were usually of 1,000 copies. Booksellers bought wholesale from publishers like Atticus and sold at retail in arcade bookstalls. Neither publisher nor bookseller gave the author anything except courtesy and occasional gifts. Royalties were unknown. Private libraries were now numerous, and about 40 B.C. Asinius Pollio made his great collection the first public library in Rome. Caesar planned a still larger one and made Varro its director, but this, like so many of his ideas, waited upon Augustus for its fulfillment. Stimulated by these facilities, Roman literature and scholarship began to equal the industry of the Alexandrians. Poems, pamphlets, histories, textbooks rivaled the Tiber's floods. Every aristocrat adorned his escapades with verse, every lady composed words and music, every general wrote memoirs. It was an age of outlines. Summaries on every subject struggled to meet the needs of a hurried commercial age. Marcus Terentius Varro, despite many military campaigns, found time during his 89 years, from 116 to 26 B.C., to synopsize nearly every branch of knowledge. His 620 volumes, some 74 books, constituted a one-man encyclopedia for his time. This book is continued on Cassette 6, Side 1.